All right, Tim. I don't even know what the interview show is, but I think you just renamed our show. That's all right, man. It's all good. My name is Ben Jarofsky, and Maya Dukmasova is my partner in crime at the Hideout, first Tuesdays and every Tuesday on my podcast. And so today we spent a lot of time talking about Eddie Gate, which is my current obsession. Uh, I'm not saying, unfortunately, we're talking housing tonight, but I'm really obsessed with Eddie Johnson Gate. But I'm going to do everything I can, my power of being, to refrain from taking another deep dive on what went down today. And we're going to talk about really important issues like housing in the city of Chicago, right, Maya?
Right. And also, I just want to put in a little plug. Today is Giving Tuesday, which is, I don't know who invented this, but this is the day you're all supposed to think about giving back to various nonprofit organizations in your communities. And I would encourage everyone to maybe consider kicking a couple of bucks to the Chicago Reader, which is now a nonprofit organization. The Chicago Reader has been free for you since 1971. We are, we operate on a shoestring budget, but we get big results. And if you donate now before the end of the year, your gift will be very much appreciated, but it is not going to be tax deductible until the start of the new year. So if you want, put a little, little reminder on your calendar to remind you in January to give to us if you really need that tax deduction. So with that, I'm Maya Dukmasova. I'm a staff writer at the Chicago Reader, where I work with Ben. And I want to welcome our guests. We've got Leah Levinger, who is the executive director of the Chicago Housing Initiative. And Daniel K. Hertz, who is, as of very recently, the policy director of the new Chicago Department of Housing and is an author and policy analyst and researcher. Give them both a round of applause. So what we like to do to kind of kick things off is to ask both our guests to explain a little bit about how they came to the work that you guys do. So Leah, I'd like to start with you. Can you talk a little bit about how you got into organizing? First of all, if you can even explain to folks what a community organizer is and what your job entails, because I think a lot of people use the words activist and organizer kind of interchangeably, but you are actually my first source on my very first story that I ever did when I became a journalist in Chicago. So, and as far back as I can remember, you've always referred to yourself and talked about your work as organizing. So just explain to folks about what that entails and how you got to be doing this.
Cool. Definitely. Hi, everyone. Is the volume okay? Yeah. Okay, awesome. So community organizing is basically a practice for changing power relations to address oppressive conditions. So if there's a constituency or a community that is suffering under something that is unjust, community organizing is a process by which neighborhood residents come together to address the forces and the circumstances that are harming their lives, harming their families, harming their communities, and making change. Community organizers are kind of like the stagehands of that movement. When we're doing our work well, you don't see us, so like you shouldn't be seeing me, but you're seeing me.
Took a lot of convincing.
Yeah. We support neighborhood leaders. We help resource them. We help put facts behind the truths that they know that may not be currently believed or acknowledged. And we try to make sure that they have the power to amplify their voices.
Did you come to this?
Yes. Okay. Ooh. I came to this work in 2000. I was a college student on the south side of Chicago at the University of Chicago, and the college was expanding in ways that were really harmful for the surrounding neighborhoods. I was a waitress who walked by a subsidized housing development on my way to the Green Line 63rd Street stop to get to work, and community was the most extreme poverty I'd ever witnessed. It was kind of the most extreme racial apartheid I'd ever witnessed, and kind of helped that particular subsidized housing community fight back against the university's ripple effects on it. My first 5 years in this work were in a volunteer capacity, And then I realized I would never have a life if I was organizing after my job. What I didn't realize is you also never have a life if you are organizing in your job. But that was a story for a later day.
Right. And this young man, introduce yourself, Daniel K. Hertz, and how you got to this position. You work for the city now, but you didn't always work for the city.
That's right. I did not start my life working for the city.
But is smart enough that he could have.
Thank you guys for having me here. This is very exciting. So my name is Daniel K. Hertz. As of on Friday, it will be 3 months. I've worked as the policy director at the Department of Housing, which I'm also going to do like a really brief explanatory thing, which is just to clarify, the Department of Housing, which is distinct from the Chicago Housing Authority, right? The CHA is sort of its own sort of federally created housing authority that runs public housing, and is not technically part of the city. It's called a sister agency. It's sort of outside. And the Department of Housing is actually part of the city and runs a whole slew of other programs related to affordable housing, and that's the one that I work for. How did I get here? So growing up, both of my parents were actually involved in community organizing. My mom did tenant organizing actually in Rogers Park in the 80s and 90s. My dad was involved in labor. And so this sort of thing was something that I heard a lot growing up around the dinner table. And then I would say, I personally, I went to Whitney Young for 7th and 8th grade, which is, as many of you know, it's a magnet school on the near west side, attracts students from all over the city. And that was sort of my, I grew up mostly in Albany Park and West Rogers Park. Before in high school, we moved out of state briefly. But going to Whitney, meeting friends there, going back to their neighborhoods for birthday parties or whatever was sort of my introduction to, oh, the city looks really different depending on where you are, and different people experience the city really differently. And I think that sort of began me down the path of sort of thinking about, well, why is that, right? And later in high school, I would start picking up books like Making the Second Ghetto by Arnold Hirsch, which sort of explores the history of segregation in Chicago and how that came to be. And won't go through like all of my path since then, but that's basically sort of directed me in a particular direction. And now I'm here.
All right. Well, first of all, let me just make a historical moment, announce that this is a historical moment. I've been doing this show First Tuesday since 2014. Before Maya was my co-host and partner in crime. It was the great, legendary Mick Dumke. And for the first 5 years of the show, we were operating under the Mayor Rahm regime. And we never once had anyone even remotely affiliated with the Mayor Rahm regime on the stage at the Hideout. They may have been sneaking around in the back, skulking around, tweeting little comments back to the boss, but they were never on the stage. So it's either Maya is extremely persuasive to get somebody from the Lori Lightfoot administration, or perhaps it's a sign of changing times. Lori Lightfoot herself was on this stage, as Tim said. All right, you mentioned Arnold. So anyway, congratulations for being the first city official ever to be on the stage of the Hideout. No pressure or anything. So, all right, we're talking about a housing policies in the city of Chicago. You mentioned Arnold Hirsch's book, which is this landmark academic work, which I urge everybody to run out as soon as this show's over to read. It's truly a great book. He died, I think, last year, so I don't think it gets the attention it wants. But when I read that book many years ago, much younger than I am, it sort of fed the beginning of the cynicism and jadedism, if that's such a word, that prevails in my brain to this very day. And that is that nobody wants affordable housing in the city of Chicago. Nobody wants integration in the city of Chicago. The powers that be don't want it. It may be community organizers who want it. It may be the sons of community organizers who write books promoting it, or writers or something. But really, most people who run the city don't want anything to do with it. And so you're just always going to be pushing a rock up a hill, and you go like an inch and then you fall back a foot. That's me at my most jaded, pessimistic moment. So Leo, why don't you start off by saying how wrong I am, and how that Arnold Hirsch was wrong as well, and that the whole thing is not just rigged, and there is hope. Go ahead.
Yes, my life never feels like pushing a big boulder up a hill and slipping back. Never feels like that. Okay, well, a little nuanced, I think. There is a corporate sector that is never going to have an interest in housing affordability, right? There's a few people making a lot of money off of housing being unaffordable and increasingly unaffordable, and those people donate a lot of money to elected officials who then also have an interest in housing not being affordable. But I think it's worth filleting out the diversity of interests inside the populace, right? There's a sector making money off of unaffordability, off of destroying affordable housing, off of retrenching the city segregation. There's a sphere that potentially can be captured by that set of corporate interests or by us, the people, right? And that's where we find our agency in this process, right? And so if you're sitting here in the audience and you are not a believer in segregation and deep inequity, you too have power, right? So those of us who have different values can organize to try to recapture the levers of democracy. That would be my slightly more nuanced answer to your true statement.
Well, I think a lot of people feel generally, that they may personally care about these issues. They may, deeply feel like the segregation and the lack of affordable housing in the city that it's wrong. But I think there's generally your average Joe folks in Chicago who might be aware enough to even care about this might say that, well, there's really nothing we can do about any of this. There's nothing I personally, as a resident, can do. I wonder if you can tell people a little bit, from your experience organizing, give folks a sense of a successful campaign that you were a part of, and how it worked from beginning to end. What were you able to accomplish, and how did you get there? Because I think a lot of people that haven't really watched some idea go from an idea to policy to actual change on the ground feel especially hopeless. And you've had a lot of experience in this arena, so tell us about something that's worked from an grassroots community organizing perspective.
Sure. I can do a recent example and a historic example. And actually, I kind of want to take a moment to just shout out some other folks in the room who are amazing organizers. Jawanza Malone, Come Oakland Community Organization. Truly one of the most hardworking. Michael Rabbit from Neighbors for Affordable Housing, Ben Goldsmith. I think I see folks from Autonomous Tenants Union somewhere. Am I right about that? Okay. Thank you for everything you guys do. Lawyers Committee for Better Housing in the House. So a recent example that I would share, a group called Neighbors for Affordable Housing. There's a couple of reps in the room. If folks followed the big kind of knockdown, drag-out fight around trying to build the first public housing in Jefferson Park on the far northwest side, how many folks kind of witnessed some of that or saw some of that in the news, right? So it was a tough fight.
Give like a Cliff's Notes version of what happened there.
Partially in response to the extreme persistent segregation of affordable and public housing in the city, the local alderman at the time, John Arena, made a kind of courageous proposal to throw the gauntlet down on segregation and proposed to build what was initially a 100-unit affordable housing development. The first public meeting had basically a lynch mob outside of it, about 300 people who were shouting only thinly disguised racial slurs.
Cabrini Green started as veterans housing. That was one of the signs, no Section 8 was being chanted. Yeah. People were basically the housing development was supposed to be, this building was supposed to be by the Jefferson Park Blue Line, and the idea was that it would be housing that would prioritize veterans and people with disabilities because these populations already are pretty significantly represented in Jefferson Park, but there's not nearly enough affordable rental housing for veterans, for people in wheelchairs, people with disabilities. And so this meeting that Leia's talking about was massively crowded. It was in this church in Jefferson Park. And one of the other signs I remember seeing was the guy standing with the sign that said, "Jefferson Park is not Rogers Park." interesting. Interesting. Unfortunately, it isn't. So that was my feeling about it. But yeah, keep going.
Yeah. There were worse things verbally said. A lot of those of us who were there in support of the housing were shoved, spat at. I mean, it was bad. And that process, it ended up being a roughly 2-year campaign to get the zoning and the funding passed. And I won't go through every element of what that fight was. It definitely took a lot of toll on the people involved. But we did eventually get the zoning passed and the funding passed, and it never doubt what a small group of committed humans can do, because that was a small group of committed humans from the Jefferson Park neighborhood and surrounding areas, and then supporting from across the city. And it's going to be 75 units of affordable housing, so it's very difficult to say that after all of that, that is all that is going to be produced, but it's a little bit of a watershed on getting affordable housing, affordable family-sized housing in a neighborhood that is one of the most job-rich regions of the city. So that's one example of just helping people not have to commute 2 hours each way to get to their jobs at O'Hare Airport, right? We believe in this as a city, right? We do. So access to that. A second example I'll share from the beginning of my work, this first 5 years as a volunteer, working with a subsidized tenant council in Woodlawn called the Grove Park Tenant Council. 504 subsidized housing development, initially slated for complete demolition through the University of Chicago's influence. And that small group of residents, mostly really badass moms, just fighting for their hardcore, amazing mothers, fought back, got a commitment for one-for-one replacement of all 504 subsidized units, got individually binding relocation rights agreements for all of the families in their community, got a job and hiring set aside. I mean, there was just a ton that they were able to accomplish. It involved some sit-ins, it involved a lot of different things, but when we fight, we win.
All right, so I'm a little less cynical for those two examples. What's your take on this, Daniel? Do you think that it is like pushing a rock up a hill, that there are a couple of victories that people get, but that the forces, by and large, are tilted against?
Well, and I mean, we can actually refer to Daniel's book also. So Daniel's the author of The Battle of Lincoln Park, which is an amazing chronicle of the history of gentrification of Lincoln Park, which was a working class, middle class Latino neighborhood in Chicago in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then slowly gentrified in a way that I think we're seeing replicated now. But there was community kind of grassroots-based resistance to that, but it doesn't, looking at it now, it doesn't seem like it succeeded, so.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a difficult question. I mean, I think the one place to start, and sort of maybe the basis of your question, right, is recognizing that we live in a city and in a country and in some ways a world with deep structural inequities and structural racism and these systems that have existed for a long time and still exist that we're pushing back against, right? So that when we talk about pushing the rock up the hill, there is a hill, right? There is these legacies that we are trying to address. So I don't want to minimize that at all. I will say there's, it's obvious to anybody who's paying attention, there's a lot of fear around a lot of things, right? Around people's neighborhoods, around their homes. In a city as segregated as Chicago, there's fear around change in that way as well. I think there are some reasons to be hopeful. I mean, just recently, another project, the Emmett Street parking lot in Logan Square, which is right next to the Logan Square Blue Line, had been a proposal for 100% affordable rental development there for years. We just finally got that passed through the city council.
When the competing idea was having some kind of open air market or something there?
Yeah, it's something.
It was like an anything but affordable housing for the opponents. That was, I think, the dynamic.
I don't even. Yeah, I mean, yeah. And there were a series of public meetings about this, and the community came out in support, right? In this neighborhood that has seen dramatic change and an enormous amount of displacement, right, over the last 20 years. there was really overwhelming community support. There was also some organized opposition, right? And even at the council meeting, right, some of that opposition came and said, hey, you haven't listened to us. And I have to say, I'm proud to work for a department and a city government now where my boss, Commissioner Marisa Navarra of the Housing Department, was there and basically said, we heard you, citizens who or residents who oppose this affordable housing, but we disagree with you, right? We have values that we were hired to represent, right, and that we've held long before we had these jobs, and those values include supporting affordable housing in places like this, right, and trying to prevent, or at least mitigate the displacement that's happening in a place like Logan Square, and preventing a place like Logan Square from becoming sort of an exclusionary housing market. So there are victories, even though there is also a mountain to climb.
I want to qualify what I said. I'm not saying things are moving in a good direction. Like, things are moving in a terrible direction. We've lost 280,000 Black residents from Chicago in the last census cycle, right? 280,000 of our Black neighbors we have lost. We have pushed out of the city. We've lost 40,000 Latinx families from Pilsen and Logan Square alone in the last few years. Things are not moving in a good direction. Like, the trajectory is not okay. And I assume that's going to be a lot of what our next steps in this conversation are about. So what I was responding to specifically was just the sense of hopelessness or powerlessness. I think we need to check, because our collective agency and standing for our values and being courageous for our values and organizing for our values is more important than ever, because the trajectory is horrible, right? That makes sense.
Yeah, no, I'm all for not being cynical. I fight it every day. It's like a 12-step program with me.
There is one, actually.
And every day is a new day. But I also spend a lot of my time following what the city leaders do. Yep. And so unless I'm willing to ignore what the city leaders are doing, I got to be honest about what I see, though it has never really paid off well for me, being honest. But so I look at the overall policies, and yes, you're absolutely correct. There was, when the local alderman was supportive, Carlos Ramirez-Rosa was supportive of that project you were alluding to in the 35th Ward. It worked. When the local alderman was supportive of that project that you were alluding to in the 41st Ward, it sort of worked until he was voted out of office, and I don't know what's happened to that project since. On small cases here and there are victories that were not present in the story that you told in the Battle of Lincoln Park, where the project couldn't get consummated way back when, and we see what happened in Lincoln Park. And then I remember the one remnant of Christopher Kennedy's gubernatorial campaign that just stuck with me.
You guys
the most.
remember Chris Kennedy?
Hey,
yeah,
man,
I didn't either.
Say what you will about his gubernatorial campaign. He flat out said that the planning policies of Mayor Rahm were dedicated to removing Black people from the city of Chicago, and I always amended it to poor people. And I want to know, like, have those policies changed in any meaningful way with the election of a new mayor, Lori Lightfoot? Have the overall structural policies of planning, of the way we approve deals, the way we fund deals like Lincoln Yards and the 78, has anything significantly changed from when Chris Kennedy made that comment back in 2018?
It's a great thing that we have an insider here to potentially comment on that.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a big question. I certainly am not going to sit here and say that 3 months after I started and 5 months after Marisa started as the first commissioner of the Department of Housing, that we've turned everything around. Everything is completely different now, right? I think there really is a very different attitude coming from leadership in naming these things, right? I mean, name in our, so we have, I don't know if this is a thing outside of like people who work in City Hall or cover this, for the reader, but so at the end of every year there are budget hearings at City Hall where the head of every department has to go in front of the entire City Council or the Finance Committee. And basically, it's like an oral exam for like as long as people want to ask them questions. And during the Department of Housing's budget hearing, we named these things, right? We said, the loss of almost 300,000 Black Chicagoans over the last 20 years is a crisis, and we ought to say that, right? And it is an indictment and a failure of our jobs, right? For providing decent communities and housing for people who shouldn't have to feel like they have to leave, right? We have 120,000 household gap in affordable housing, as determined by the Institute for Housing Studies at DePaul, right? And we are chipping away at that. I think, I think we are looking at what the city can do that can change some of those dynamics, right? So we've launched this ARO Inclusionary Housing Task Force, not just the task force, but sort of a whole review process, right? To look at, we have all of these affordable housing production programs. We produce, something on the order of 1,200 new rental affordable housing homes a year. We support nearly 3,000 extremely low-income families through a rental subsidy program. We do all these things. We also have this tool, the ARO, that is meant, the Affordable Requirements Ordinance, that is really meant, especially among those programs, to be an inclusionary program, right? Not just to deliver affordable housing, but to deliver it in places where it has not historically existed, or where the housing market is changing in a way that is rapidly diminishing that supply of affordable housing. And the ARO has certainly accomplished some good things, but I think there's a lot of critique, including from folks on the stage, which we take very much to heart. Which we take very much to heart, and which I think Marisa Navarra and I and other people before they reached the city have made some of those critiques as well. And so we want to look at how can we, not just with the ARO, but with all of our potential inclusionary policies, how do we actually meaningfully change the structure of how we do housing policy to deliver more of those units in places where they will change the historic patterns of segregation and inequality in the city.
So just to give folks a little context in case you're not, super into the weeds about the ARO and all that, and all of those things. So the Affordable Requirements Ordinance is this law that we have in Chicago, this like municipal rule that if a developer wants to build a new residential building with more than 10 units, right, that either is in need of a zoning change from the city, or is getting some kind of subsidy from the city, or is the developer is buying a piece of city land at a discounted price, that the city then requires that developer to set aside 10% of the units in the future development to be affordable housing. And in some areas of the city, like in certain sectors that they've decided that are even in more dire need of affordable housing, I think now the requirement is like 20%.
It varies, and it's percentages or pay a fee,
right?
Which is
so
more often.
Yeah, so the developers either have to build. So if they're building one big building, they have to set aside a certain number of units to be affordable housing, affordable to people making like a certain, below a certain threshold below a certain threshold of income. They either have to include that housing in the on-site at the project wherever it's getting built, or it has to be off-site. So they might build a second building somewhere within a 2-mile radius. Or if they don't want to build anything at all, they can pay this in lieu fee, which is the amount of it also depends a little bit on which part of the city it's in. But if they don't want to build any of the affordable housing, they essentially pay a fine for it to the city. And the city then is supposed to turn around and use that money to subsidize rents, or help affordable housing developers who are only building affordable housing complete their projects wherever they may be in the city. And so the new Department of Housing, as of a few weeks ago, has released this kind of data portal that you can find online. I wrote a story about this a few weeks ago that shows how this ARO has been in place for over a decade now, but this new data portal that the city is now releasing shows how many units have actually been constructed, how many units of affordable housing have been constructed. And it's like fewer than 450 units that have been constructed in over a decade. And as far as the in lieu fee goes, that money has been used to subsidize rents, but the long story short is that there's not, there's like a shortage of something like 160,000 units of affordable housing in the city. So 450 units is great, but like nowhere near enough to bridge the gap. People argue that either we need to make it easier to build affordable housing and cheaper and kind of stimulate the supply side of things, or we actually need to tackle the unaffordability of the existing supply of housing and set some regulations, some limits in place in how much landlords can charge for rent. Because there's something like 650,000 renters in the city of Chicago, and a huge proportion of a city. I'm pretty sure the last numbers I saw was that like more than half of the renters in the city of Chicago pay more than 30% of their income in rent. So that means that their rent is unaffordable. So Leah, I'm wondering if you could first tell us, so that's just a little Cliff's Notes version of this issue. So can you just tell us a little bit, let's talk about the supply side, affordable requirements side of things first.
Sure.
What do you see? You just had an action on Friday that focused on shaming a developer for not following the ARO requirements.
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about that, and just, in general, what your thoughts are about how effective of a strategy the ARO is at actually bringing us some affordable housing.
Sure. Okay. I am not going to respond to your questions in that order. They are all excellent questions. So zooming out, I want to say Chicago Housing Initiative, which is a coalition, a citywide coalition. I'm just the staffer of this octopus of glory. Chicago Housing Initiative has a three-plank platform that we think would do a lot to meaningfully really chisel away at the housing crisis. Two pieces that we can move at the city level currently. One piece that the Lift the Ban Coalition, which I encourage you all to talk to Jawanza about, needs to win at the state level before we can move anything at the city level. But the three planks are, one, we have to make the public housing system work, and we have to preserve it and protect it, because actually housing that is taken out of market dynamics is incredibly vital. There's no replacement for it. There's no getting around the need for just publicly funded, publicly owned and controlled housing that is not subjected to the whims of the market and the corporate sphere. One, public housing, it's important, let's protect it. What we have left, right? Two, inclusionary zoning, which is this broader kind of name for the kind of policy tool that the city's affordable requirements ordinance is based on. I'm gonna come back to that about the deep dive of inclusionary zoning, because you really want to know about it. You just don't know that you want to know about it. And then three, when Jawanza and his team succeed at lifting the statewide ban on rent control, we need a rent control policy here in Chicago, because the market is always going to be brutal and increasingly predatory. So three planks. To zoom in on the inclusionary zoning piece, which is just like if you imagine it as a three-legged stool, we need all three legs. We need all of those, each of those. But if you, to zoom in on just this question of setting aside affordable housing as part of new development, it is an important tool to the extent that the city does it right to reduce the patterns of segregation and provide access to affordable housing and equalize patterns of investment. So where to start? Inclusionary zoning is basically the concept that, Maya, let's say you're a developer, and let's say I'm the city council, because this will be fun. So you buy a parcel of land that's zoned for 10 units, and you want to build 100 units. I, the city council, have all the power to say, like, yes, you can build 100 units, or no, you can't, right? It's actually a public question of zoning, right? Normally, I, the city council, can't do shit to tell Maya what to do, because Maya is a private developer, right? But if Maya wants to build hundreds more units and change the zoning, suddenly I, the government sphere, have some power over to make a trade in that relationship,
And
right?
tell folks about how the Supreme Court has affirmed over and over again municipalities' rights to set some limits and requirements on
Right.
developers such as myself
Exactly, yeah.
using land in a
Right.
city.
Right. So it's an area of law that the Supreme Court, the developers have challenged this again and again and again because, of course, it's extremely profitable to them to not have any restrictions on what rents they charge. They want to be able to charge whatever they can. So they've challenged it. It's gone up to the Supreme Court a number of times, and the Supreme Court has always ruled that city governments have the power to control zoning and set basically whatever terms they want on those rezoning decisions. What makes that a really special tool is anything else the government might do to try to intervene in private market dynamics, private development dynamics, will get challenged based on constitutionality grounds as a takings from the private sector.
What does that mean?
Takings is a concept where basically the amendment in the Constitution that says government can't seize private property for public use. So without...
So if on my parcel of land where it's already zoned for 10 units and all I wanted to do was build 10 units, you, the city council, can't ask me anything. You can't require me to do anything. Like, I get to do whatever I want. But
I'm not willing to see that territory entirely yet, but it would be unprecedented. There isn't a precedent that's run up to the Supreme Court around what's called by right development. So if you already have the zoning change in place, it becomes a lot more contentious about whether city councils can say, I'm going to withhold permits, for example, unless you do affordable housing.
But if I want you, the city council, to give me permission to
Yes.
build 100 units instead
Correct.
of 10, you
I
get
get
to
to do
impose some.
whatever I-
And are we in the city of Chicago using this power
Yes.
as much as we could be in terms of
Right.
grabbing the developers, you know, by whatever genitalia they may have?
Yeah, right. You know, my answer is no. So our argument as an affordable housing coalition, and we are right about this, is that the city has vastly under-negotiated for the public in these exchanges.
Under
Right.
Danny Solis as the zoning committee chair, you gotta be
I
kidding
know
me.
it's shocking, but true. Yes. And our argument is that the city council can actually do some really transformative, powerful things, and so can the mayor's administration, in really thinking about how to use this tool in the most impactful and transformative ways. And we argue that it's not just kind of the linear pathway of, you know, Maya, the developer, wants to build a 100-unit building. We advocate for 30% affordable set aside in high rent and gentrifying neighborhoods. So there's the linear pathway to get more affordable housing, but there's also an element of, not to kind of wonk out here, but there's also an element of like driving a dagger into the heart of racialized capitalism, right? And what I mean by that, not to be all like socialists up here, but what I mean by that is if we think about what happened in Chicago, right, and continues to happen in Chicago, we have neighborhoods that, because of redlining and because of restrictive covenants, right, we have neighborhoods that are zones of affluence and wealth, and we have neighborhoods that are basically sacrifice zones, right? And God bless it, I hope as people we've transcended past that in terms of our values as humanity now, but we don't have the structures to, we have tools to intervene in those dynamics that we're not fully using, and zoning power is, we argue, part of that, right? So if under our proposal, which is called the Development for All Ordinance, we are pushing for 30% affordable set aside in high rent neighborhoods and gentrifying neighborhoods, but leaving the percentage at the same level but dropping rents in lower cost neighborhoods. What that would mean is that developers would have a higher community benefit obligation in some of these segregated white spaces and segregated affluent spaces. And what we think that would produce is, if right now developers only want to build in Logan Square, Pilsen, right? And none of them are ever investing in areas that genuinely have vacant lots and blighted housing and no investment and no development happening. Kind of spread out and equalize the dynamics a bit because it changes the financial incentives of where private investors think they may want to build. where it's not just the pile-on of hyperdevelopment and underdevelopment, which as a coalition we see as related phenomena, right? It's not like the disinvestment in Lawndale and the hyperinvestment in Logan Square are unrelated to each other, right? These are related phenomena, and we have to treat them and like treat the entire city of Chicago as kind of like a body, right? Think about it like a circulatory system. If all the capital is flowing to one hand and none of the capital is flowing to the other, right? All of the investment is going to one side and none of the investment to the other. That's an unhealthy system, right? And to the extent that we can intervene within it, and zoning power gives us some power to do that legally, that we should, to create more equitable patterns across the entire city.
Well, that was very well done.
Thank you.
And battling the cynicism that's always welling up in me. I just want to make one little adjustment to what you said.
Yep.
You start off by saying you were talking about the limitations of zoning law, and that anything that the city does to intervene in private property or in the marketplace gets challenged in the courts immediately. I would disagree on the point of when it comes to subsidizing upscale development, which is as about a big an intervention in the marketplace as I've ever seen.
Important.
That never gets challenged anywhere by anybody in the city of Chicago except for a couple reader writers,
Right.
and
Okay.
nobody
This
cares
man
about
speaks
them.
the truth,
So
speaks the truth.
yeah, so
Yep.
I never
Yep,
believed
yep.
that the stuff about free market
Sure.
values in
Yeah,
the city
yeah.
of Chicago
No,
because I see the
sparkle fingers,
hypocrisy all the
100%,
time.
100%.
All right, so I had to get that off my
No,
system.
thank you, thank you.
All right, so getting back to, you said that you have some proposals, and Daniel, not asking you to speak for the city of Chicago, but you are here for the city of
But
Chicago.
asking you to speak for the city of Chicago.
So what's your reaction to the ideas that Leah put out there?
Yeah, Daniel.
As the city of Chicago. No, I mean, so.
Really put him on the hot seat. We
Hey,
asked his boss to come, and they
I-
were like,
One sec,
"Sorry,
one.
we're going to
Just
bring
take
you
one.
Daniel."
I said yes. So to be frank, so we're at DOH, we're walking a bit of a fine line here on specifically the question of inclusionary zoning and the Affordable Requirements Ordinance, because I mean we are launching this 4 to 6 month process of review and task force and focus groups and public comment and all this. About what we should do about the ARO and also about the idea of inclusionary housing more broadly, and we are taking it seriously in the sense that we do not have predetermined outcomes that we are trying to reach. We have committed to, among other proposals, taking seriously the Development for All proposal that Chicago Housing Initiative has put forward. That will be one of the things that we review, along with other proposals that other folks have passed along to us. But we're also trying to be upfront that we are not coming into this as a blank slate, right? Ourselves at DOH and as the city, right? We are coming into this with a set of principles and priorities and sort of guidelines, right? We want to see the ARO used as a tool to push against historic patterns of inequality and segregation. Right, we want to use the ARO as a tool to fight against the structural racism, right? That and just patterns of sort of disparate patterns of investment that have happened in the city. How, I as the person who is up here speaking in my capacity as a worker for the Department of Housing. We can't say a lot more than that, right? We can say, these are our principles. These are where we want to see it go in terms of exactly how we get there. We are actively trying not to prejudge that and let the process take place with integrity. So, I think I sort of have to leave it there.
So, can I ask a question that's sort of been eating at me as I've been following the news about what you guys are doing? So, part of the kind of new era of transparency around housing policy with the city, it was the first thing was the rollout of this portal. So now this is not data that was hidden or private before, but you would have had to file a data request to find out, how many units of affordable housing
And then your data request would be conceived as overly burdensome and not responded to.
Yeah. So now you don't have to go through that process. You go to, what is it?
Not that I've been through that. I haven't.
Chicago.gov/ARO.
Yeah, and you can look in this wonderful little data portal and look at the maps and see, by neighborhood where the affordable housing is getting built, where it's not built, how many units have been constructed, how many are under construction, how many have been approved, et cetera, et cetera. So another chapter in this story of Lightfield administration taking a new approach to affordable housing and apparently trying to do something about increasing the amount of affordable housing in the city, is the formation of this task force, which is something, almost 20 different members?
20 people, yeah.
Yeah, so people from the development community, organizers, policy experts who've been brought together by the city. The task force is going to be chaired by Alderman Osterman and Burnett, right?
And Byron Sigcho Lopez.
Right. So these are aldermen who've been, at the forefront of housing issues, for better or for worse, for years, especially Walter Burnett. Anyway, so this task force is the goal of it seems to be to evaluate what can be improved about the city's inclusionary zoning practices. My question is, why isn't Leah on the task force? Because when I looked at the list, I thought I was going to see her name, because you applied, is my understanding.
Yeah, I did.
What, do you know why she's not on the task force?
So this is going to be a disappointing answer, I realize, for this audience, but when we had conversations with a lot of different people internally, with aldermanic co-chairs, we have 3 other co-chairs who are not aldermen, and we were very clear that all of our discussions would be confidential, and they sort of needed to have them, honestly. So I can't talk about it.
Well, I had to ask. So, to pivot, Ben, are you? Leah mentioned this issue, and this is something that I imagine that's even harder to tackle for the city, because it's really in the realm of hypotheticals now. But you mentioned the 3 pillars of the work that you're doing with the Chicago Housing Initiative, being the improving the inclusionary zoning, which is tackling the supply. But the other 2 things are removing the ban for rent regulation and rent control. That's a statewide ban that was passed in the 90s when the State House was controlled by Republicans, and when ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is this stand your ground laws, super hyper-conservative organization that lobbied for all kinds of very conservative policy changes at state houses across the country. This rent control ban, which just basically says that you cannot have any kind of rent regulation on residential or commercial properties in the city, in the state of Illinois. Identical bans to this were passed around the country. It was in the ALEC handbook in the mid-90s. So one of the steps is lifting the ban, literally repealing this ban. And then the second step would be to presumably set up some kind of rent regulation, either statewide or in the city of Chicago. I think there's if people have heard of rent control, unless you're from New York City and you've experienced rent control, a lot of the information out there tends to skew to the side of, rent control doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's a bad idea. It's a bad policy. So can you just explain to folks a little bit about what are the visions for rent regulation as they're being proposed now, either statewide or just for the city of Chicago, and just do a basic explanation and kind of myth busting, because rent control is not saying you shall not raise your rent, above a certain price. It's not a cap on prices. Talk a little bit about the misconceptions and what is actually being proposed for the city or the state.
I mean, that is the biggest misconception, is that there's no mechanism under rent control policies for cost of inflation to be considered, or cost of changes in property taxes to be considered. And it's actually very easy to create mechanisms that stabilize rental prices and protect tenants from extreme changes in rent levels. that allow for inflationary pressures to be considered. We actually do it with a lot of the subsidized housing stock in the city is actually rent controlled through mortgage-based use restrictions or affordability contracts.
What's that?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, just throw things at me if I get a little technical because I have been known to get a little technical. So you can kind of predict what it costs to operate housing, right? Like we all have budgets, you have budgets, developers have budgets. You can kind of anticipate what the cost generally will be. And then, certainly when a developer buys a building, the biggest expense that they have is their mortgage, which amortizes in a generally pretty predictable way over 30 years, right? Sometimes with 5-year periods. But you can kind of anticipate what those costs will be. There's no reason that rents from a financial perspective need to jump up $500, right? Like that is not driven by operating costs. That is not necessitated by operating costs. In general, right? It's driven by people saying, there's a market where I can take advantage of this. I think the other dynamic that I encourage people to think about is that the ownership of rental housing is changing a lot. We used to have rental stock that was mainly like mom and pop owners, people who were just trying to pay the mortgage, like this was their retirement income, right? Completely respectable. The ownership is becoming more and more consolidated, more and more equity firms, multinationals, right? And those folks treat rental housing, the level at which it separates out from thinking of housing as a human right and really just treating housing as a commodity is extreme, and it really changes the way those builders and operators of housing manage their properties in ways that are really, really devastating to people's lives. Like my life is basically watching people cry pretty much every week about what's happening in their housing. And I'm sure there's people in this room who have experienced what it's like to not have affordable housing or have family members who have, but it's some of the most stressful things that can happen to people. And it's driven increasingly by a corporate sector that has a ton of like monopoly over the supply and therefore a ton of power to control pricing. And it's not about operating costs.
Before we turn it over to the audience for questions, Leah, I have to ask you, this is a personal question, I'm going to ask you anyway. Let's see how you avoid this question. Your knowledge of how real estate works is very impressive. And I'm sitting here listening to you, and I'm thinking that if you went on the other side, you would make a fortune, and they would let you be on the task force.
It's true. It's true. I would earn my way onto the task force.
But you may not want to be on the task force. So, why don't you? Make a lot of money.
The soul is a real thing, actually. And I know we try to deny it in our like contemporary culture, but no, yeah. Thank you. No, I love, and I mean that in a very deep way. I love the communities that I work for and work with. I love them.
All right, just had to ask that question.
Yeah.
All right, let's kick it open to the audience. You want to do it?
Whoa. Okay. Yeah. So I guess let's, and then we reserve the right to jump in if we have further questions. But there look to be some eager folks in the audience. So
now, since President Colleton, I think, is either retiring or resigning, what are the odds of the rent control repeal passing now, since Colleton is basically leaving?
Excellent question.
Can stop that microphone right there with that man. No, that man right there. No, that man right there, Jawanza. Come on, this is your baby, man.
you're gonna have to be the face of it.
I'm just following orders.
If I just keep waving my hand at you, I feel like eventually you will concede. No.
John Cullerton is for the folks who may not be aware, is the what is it called? Like the president of the Senate?
President
is
of
that
the
the
Senate.
official? Yeah. So he's also deeply, he has a property tax appeal law business, which if you aren't following about how those folks are involved with what's happening with real estate in Chicago, go check out the ProPublica Illinois investigations into the property tax stuff. But so I'm gonna let you get back to this question.
Okay. All right. Great question. I mean, it's a statewide fight. It's a statewide campaign. I mean, I think all of us, and I just shout out again to Coco, shout out again to Lawyers Clinic for Better Housing, shout out to people who are not me, for really leading the fight to lift the ban on rent control. But I think everyone knew getting into that this was going to be a long-term fight, that building a statewide coalition is incredibly difficult, and that the sector arrayed against us has a ton more money than we ever will. So it's a tough fight, but I think what I'd highlight is just the dedication of the coalition members involved in that campaign is cannot be overestimated, and the necessity for people's lives in this moving forward for us to get some kind of rent stabilization policy. This is life or death, and when things become life or death for people, folks keep persisting even against incredible odds. That's what I'd say about that.
Do you have any thoughts on this?
I venture no predictions about Springfield one way or another.
Don't forget that.
My guess is that the key player is Pritzker, so it really doesn't matter who the state Senate president is. So if he wants it, there's a
Yeah,
better
and
chance
I've heard that as far as obstruction goes, Cullerton was a much bigger opponent of any progress on this legislation than Mike Madigan in the State House. What I've heard about Madigan on this issue is that if the representatives in the State House can, whip up enough people in support of this legislation, that he's happy to let them do their thing.
because
But
he
he's
knows
not
that
helping
Cullerton's
them
gonna
either.
block it in the Senate.
Yeah, he's not helping them either. But it seems like, from what I've heard, that he's not being particularly obstructionist at this point, not to the degree that Cullerton has been. So, Bird.
With respect, carve-outs for poor people in exclusive developments cannot stem the loss of organically affordable inventory. What can we, as a woke populace, partnering with a newly elevated and well-intentioned administration do to reverse, to stem and to reverse the loss of inherently affordable stock, such as two flats and coach houses and the things that really make our community thrive?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think we 100% agree that the ARO, any inclusionary policy is not just in terms of volume going to replace the term in the industry is naturally occurring affordable housing. That's not a great word for it. No, it suggests that the housing market is natural somehow, which, as we've covered, it's not. But not capital A affordable housing, right? And we are losing, right? I mean, there's lots of research showing, especially with 2 to 4 flats, which have historically been sort of the bedrock of low to moderately priced rental housing in the city, and many neighborhoods in the city are rapidly being lost. Interestingly, they're being lost on both sides of the city, actually. We've gotten a lot of attention to the loss of 2 to 4 flats on the north side being converted to single-family homes, being torn down and replaced with new housing, which often is obviously much more expensive, but even often has fewer homes in the building than what was torn down. They're also being lost really rapidly in parts of the south side because of disinvestment, abandonment, the loss of population that we've talked about, right? So both sides of that represent the loss of real sort of moderately priced housing. We are looking at what to do about that. I can't make any big policy announcements on this stage, but I can say we're very actively looking at what we can do about that. There's a number of aldermen who are very interested in that issue and who we were working with, as well as researchers, as well as organizers and advocates. One thing I will say is we're looking at, and this is certainly not the thing that solves the problem, but I think it can help. What's called accessory dwelling units. which basically just means if you have a basement that you currently use as a laundry room that's half above ground, you could turn that into a basement apartment.
This was Paul Vallis's big housing
What's that?
proposal. I'm pretty sure. Do you remember Paul Vallis? Yeah, you do. Paul Vallis's big affordable housing proposal had to do with garden apartments.
Yeah, so this would be not only garden apartments or basement apartments, but also attics and also coach houses, right? Backyard cottages, which have historically been a part of Chicago's historic building stock. They were made effectively illegal in the middle of the century when
Why?
Basically a monolith of planning conventional wisdom that said that the city should be more like the suburbs. There was a lot of push towards single-family homes, towards rationalizing uses, which meant taking commercial corner stores away. It also meant taking backyard cottages away. So we're looking at how can we rebuild some of that stock. Also, a lot of those basement units, especially basements, are actually currently being used for housing. They're just informal housing, right? So how do we bring those into the formal system where they have where they can be part of the housing system. So that is one way, I think, both to add some of those units that are sort of, again, I don't like this word, but naturally more moderately priced. And also maybe a way to incentivize people who own single-family homes, 2 flats, 3 flats, not to deconvert them, but to actually add housing units to their buildings in ways that is not disruptive to, a residential block.
Sounds like it's on your radar at the city. So,
I think, broadly speaking, and I just really appreciate the insightful comment, the scale of what is happening to neighborhoods in the city, while we have three things that we believe in that meaningfully respond to that. The scale of what is happening, we need something at scale that responds to that, and that solution at scale that responds to that is rent control. And there's nothing at scale that's going to respond to that isn't rent control.
Can you imagine if rent control existed in 1970 or whenever this, by the way, is a very good book, Daniel K. Hertz, The Battle of Lincoln Park, particularly the concluding chapter where he talks, the whole history of Lincoln Park's development comes down to a series of fights in this book anyway, between advocates, the Leah Levingers of their day who were trying to...
Puerto Rican.
Yeah. And
in Lincoln Park.
In Lincoln Park,
For the record.
who are trying to, prevent the wide-scale gentrification. I don't even know if they called it gentrification in those days.
No.
And then just the real estate market, the forces were victorious.
and the best thing about this book, which I just can't recommend enough for everyone to read who wants to understand how Chicago works, is the way that these bougie white people in Lincoln Park, especially in Old Town, used this concept of historic preservation and needing to preserve, Old Town to have this historic charm. They just use that to actually destroy huge sections of Old Town in Lincoln Park and stake out an area, of historic charm just for them, basically, and push out all the working class.
So if we had rent control in 1972 or 3.
I mean, I think we did. That's when the Nixon price.
Well,
the price caps, the Nixon era inflationary.
Which
There was
lasted
a brief nationwide
yeah.
rent control situation.
if we had rent control in this time, how would it have worked? Just so folks know, how would it have worked to prevent the widespread gentrification of an entire community?
So I don't know that I'm qualified to answer from a completely historic perspective, but just in terms of if you think about the mechanisms and systems that fund gentrification, investors' belief that they will be able to flip neighborhoods is the belief on which they invest in neighborhoods, right? So you kind of see capital players, to some degree, conspiring together to kind of take a neighborhood that is naturally occurring affordable housing, right? Generally in Chicago, serving a community of color, working class community of color, right? And these interests kind of conspire to say, not that this is a community, right? This isn't a community this is an undervalued asset, right? That's how capitalist investors think about neighborhoods, particularly the neighborhoods of communities of color, right? This is an undervalued asset, and if we can conspire to get certain kinds of investment into this neighborhood to attract a higher income and generally whiter populace, we can appropriately value this asset, right, and make a ton of money in the process. So rent control, as something that says, hey, you're not going to speculate on a community. This is a place where people live. This is a place where people relate. This is a place where people raise their children and love each other, right? This is not an undervalued asset. This is a community, and the rents can only go up so much in a single year. Completely kind of takes the bottom out of that kind of predatory investment scheme, right? It is a predatory investment scheme of people with a ton of wealth looking at a community of an entire community of people as something that they can possess and reshape. And the amount of capital that now like flows into some of these spaces, like the consolidation of wealth, the growing inequality of income and wealth, like we need to really grapple with that as a society, all of us, like whatever our class positioning, if we're not like the 1%, because believe me, like whoever you are, if you're not the 1%, they're coming for you too, right? Like, I mean, there is a real, there's a trajectory here that we all have a stake in fighting back against.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Daniel, just wondering if you could explain a little bit about Commissioner Cox's Invest South and West program, how that's scheduled to work. And just so it doesn't get lost in the shuffle, Ben, if you find yourself with a minute before the program is over, could you please give us your thoughts on Eddygate?
No, I'm vetoing that. No. We're here to talk about housing. If you guys want to hear about Eddygate, you come back in January for our January 1st Tuesdays.
Thank you for the question. So for those of you who don't know, Invest Southwest is an initiative that the administration announced 3 weeks ago. And the idea is basically to pick, I believe it's 10 or 12 corridors, commercial corridors on the south and west sides, to really pour resources into them, rebuild them as neighborhood downtowns, essentially, in the sort of traditional way that neighborhood downtowns, commercial corridors have functioned in that way in Chicago. Unfortunately, so that is primarily a program of the Department of Planning and Development. So I'm not, and Maurice Cox mentioned is the commissioner. So that's not something that I've been deeply involved in a way that I could really give a lot of background. I will say, from DOH's perspective, we have been involved in sort of recognizing that, neighborhood downtowns, neighborhood sort of centers don't make sense unless there is a neighborhood around them of people who live in housing, right? So, we are also thinking about what is the role of housing investment, right, and affordable housing investment surrounding those corridors, and any others that are announced later, in sort of helping further that initiative. But like I said, primarily that's a DPD thing, so I don't want to speak too much on their behalf.
Okay, good chance.
Hey,
Next question. Yeah.
so Daniel, you're a good guy working on the inside, and there's only a couple of people in this room, so whatever you say is just between us. But knowing that there's an ordinance that's been introduced to create a community benefits agreement connected to the Obama Presidential Center to stop people from being displaced. The last set of meetings, the city representatives have said that the ARO portion of that ordinance is going to be taken off the table. Can you commit as a good guy that that'll get put back on the table, and we can get an ordinance passed so that people can stop being displaced from Woodlawn and South Shore?
Well, I'm sorry, before you answer that, can you just explain to folks, this is Joanne Malone, who's with the Kenwood Oakland Community Organization. Why would there be an ARO component to the library development? What was the original idea and what was taken off the table? Can you just give folks some context?
The tweet version, people have been being displaced from Woodlawn.
Property values are going up around where the library will be.
Right. Speculators come in. Prices have been going through the roof. Families got to go someplace else to live. And so for a lot of what's been driving this is rehab. So not necessarily demolition, not necessarily brand new construction, but people coming in and rehabbing properties and then charging ridiculous rents for those properties. And so part of the ordinance includes not just set asides, not just for new construction, but also for rehab. And we're asking for 30% of those rehab new
So if a
construction.
developer wants to come in and do rehab in a residential building within a certain radius of the Obama Center, they would have to set aside a certain number of
30%.
units for, okay, so that's been taken off the table?
Yep.
Okay. So now you can answer the question.
Thank you. So, you know, for the one or two other people in the room, DOH has been involved, and other parts of other departments, DPD, other folks, have been involved in sort of community outreach in Woodlawn for a few months now, pretty intensively. And, you know, we are working with as much urgency, as much speed as we possibly can on putting together a package of an ordinance or package of ordinances that will address, you know, what is obviously a very real concern about displacement and gentrification in Woodlawn. I mean, that is something that is happening, right? You know, we also, at the same time, right, are also undertaking this also urgent but somewhat longer process of looking at the ARO, looking at our inclusionary housing programs. We want to make sure that we are not doing something right now that is going to have to be changed or is going to have to be sort of adapted into that, right? And so I think one of the things that we are absolutely going to talk about in this sort of ARO process, right, is how are things going to look different in different parts of the city, right? What do we need to do differently in a place like Woodlawn that is, you know, currently, you know, not an extremely high-priced neighborhood, but is clearly seeing pressures to move up there, is seeing rehabs and some amount of new construction that may increase in the, you know, near to medium-term future. How do we need to treat inclusionary housing policies there differently than we would in other parts of the city? So we do ultimately want to get there. I think we want to get to the sort of another package of ordinances that we can do even faster than that first, and then look at the question of how do we treat Woodlawn, neighborhoods like Woodlawn different. And South Shore, you know, Hermosa, Garfield Park, any number of neighborhoods across the city that are experiencing similar pressures.
You know, I gotta ask before we take the next question. Is it weird for you, Daniel, to like now be speaking for the city after so many years in your prior job at the Center for Tax and Budgetary Priorities, poking at the city for all the things they're doing wrong? I mean, if I remember correctly, you guys collaborated on exposing the fact that the CHA was like sitting on all this money that they weren't distributing, that they had been
440 million.
Yeah, the money that had been allocated by the federal government for housing choice vouchers, for Section 8 vouchers, and that they weren't distributing. Like, you two were like the reason that story came to light. And
there's a lot of really nerdy spreadsheet work going on.
Yeah, I remember meeting with you guys about it. I mean, what is it like for you now to be like having to like be speaking for the city, just like personally? Has it been a hard transition?
Are you allowed to answer that question? He is. He's allowed. You're allowed. You're allowed.
Yeah. No, it's yeah. No, I mean, so one thing that's been way I'll answer this question is by saying one thing that's been actually kind of cool is getting to start at a time that, you know, just thinking about who else is in, you know, Department of Housing, new department, new commissioner, several other new folks coming in who are all sort of first time in government, and so we've sort of gotten to say like, yeah, we all 4, 5, 6 months ago were on the other side of the table, and yeah, I mean, obviously it's very different, right? I mean, you know, yeah, I don't know quite what to say beyond that. No, I mean, thank you.
Just don't be out drinking with a woman who's not your wife late at night, and then falling asleep by the curb of your, you know, just don't do that.
I couldn't talk about it.
Fair enough.
Next thing you know.
No, I mean, I guess I'll say it is very different, right? It is, you know, it's just a different set of you know, obligations and perspectives and all sorts of things. I will say, and I think I said this before, but I am genuinely proud to work for the department at a time when, you know, our leadership is willing to say things about our values and about our principles that the Department of Housing or DPD has not necessarily said before, right, and has not made commitments about before, and that makes me feel good to be here.
Hey, Layla, as an organizer, what are your asks for the audience here?
Ask for the audience here. Well,
Tell them about the action last Friday.
Oh, right, I didn't actually cover that. Sometimes we protest scofflaw developers. Come hang out with us when we do that. I think next Wednesday there is a subject matter hearing in City Council, in City Council chambers, on the Development for All ordinance, which is what the Chai Coalition has put together as its our coalitional version of reforming the Affordable Requirements Ordinance. Please come. December 11th, noon. We're doing press conference at 12:30. Hearing begins at 1. In the back, I think there is a volunteer, Ben, from our coalition who might have sign-up sheets. Please come. Or give us your contact information if you're willing to be called for anything. Just note, like, what might you want to do? We'll find a way to plug you in, like we need you. Organizing work is always deeply, deeply understaffed and under-resourced, so if you have something to give, like, we'll take it. We'll figure out what it is. But yeah, the next upcoming event is next Wednesday, December 11th. Second floor of City Hall, 12:30. Be there. Come support.
And the fact that you're a coalition means that people can get involved with the organization that comprise.
Correct.
Talk about which organizations comprise your coalition.
Sure.
Because people can get involved with like what's already in their neighborhood, right?
Right, exactly. We have member institutions that are community based on most sides of town. Not really on the west side, I'm sad to say, but most sides of town. And so if you're looking to plug in, we can help you connect with the organization that's most in your geography, and you can be part of kind of local work and citywide work at the same time. We all partner together. I think other things to think about. Well, yeah, that would probably be the easiest step. And Ben, do you want to raise your hands? Are you still around? Do we still have Ben? Okay, maybe not.
He's right in the gold bar. Right.
Okay. Okay, got you. So there's a person who can collect your contact information, or feel free to come up to me and let me know of your interest, and we'll figure out a way to plug you in.
Hi. First of all, I want to really thank you. I'm over here. See, white hair. For that explanation of rent control, because I recognize that, and have for about a year now, that they are coming for me. I live in a 183-unit condominium building that's had predatory people coming after us for the past 2 years. And
buying up units in your
condo?
Well,
we think, but we're not sure, and we're not very organized. Our board, it's one of those. But we've had offers to buy our building and to then go to deconversion. So people who look like me, right, we're moving to Schaumburg. I mean, a woman today was moving out. She's going to Glenview, which to me is just as bad. I think it's Republican there. Anyway, but I don't know how many of us, especially because most of the people in my building have been there for over 20 years. The building is about 70 years old. So there's some people who lived there as kids, with their parents. And but anyway, it seems to be a trend, the way condo conversion was a trend in the 70s, which, a lot of us who look like me were a part of that. And I don't see any concerted effort anywhere to stop that. It does seem that rent control would stop that. I never had heard that before. And I think, as a community organizer, you should look to people like us, right, to get on board with it, because we don't care about it. We don't even know about it until you just said that.
But would rent control really impact condo owners, though? Yeah. How could it help them?
I mean, I think the connection that the woman is pointing to is that there's a particular design behind the investment scheme that her community is being preyed upon, right? Where the concept, I believe, kind of the connection you're drawing, is there's an investor or a set of investors who believe that they could profiteer off of that the mortgage on your condos is far less than what they could make in rent, right? And they see that opportunity, and when investors see an opportunity to make money, they don't care who they harm or what they destroy in that process. And I think that is a very real connection, right? That they are now seeing this woman's community also as an undervalued asset because the mortgages are less than what the highly inflated rental market would provide. Is that the connection?
And if there was rent control, then what their potential for profit would be curtailed.
Would be curtailed and limited, right? It would be a disincentive. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a yes. Good. What's happening right there? There we go. There we go. That's what it's about, people. That's what it's about. That. Okay. I think it's a really insightful connection, right?
Okay, one more.
Yeah, we'll take one more question.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I was recently looking at a map of like average rents and price burdens across the state of Chicago, and one thing I noticed was that the areas that are the most rent burdened tend to be black neighborhoods on the south and west sides. And when I was reading Maya's article about Pangea being predatory to many apartments on South Shore, I saw that South Shore had the highest rates of eviction, even more than many other gentrifying neighborhoods. So I was wondering, both on the Shy Housing end as well as the city end, what are ways to address like the loss and like rent and burden of rents on the south and west side, specifically because affordable housing in the city defined at its current rate is still more pricey than average median rents as well as affordable rents in the neighborhood. So how are those being addressed in black neighborhoods specifically?
So specifically, how do we increase affordability in south and west side neighborhoods? Yeah, rental affordability and reduce or mitigate the eviction problem.
Both, but also specifically making sure that they're affordable to south side residents
Right.
rather than just city high rates.
Right, absolutely, yeah. So complete agreement about the statement of the problem. One thing that I neglected to mention, and I encourage folks to talk with Frank at the Lawyers Committee for Better Housing if they're interested more in this, is the work to pass a just cause for eviction ordinance in the city, where there are protections mitigating eviction pressures, or just like how families can be evicted, the need for actual cause. Okay. Some of the challenges that we have around specifically south and west side neighborhoods, and I encourage others to jump in here, is that one of the dynamics is that because of the history of redlining, restrictive covenants, everything else, the market is actually depressed below what it often costs to actually sustain high quality housing, and because of racialized inequities in income, the incomes that families are often working with is also lower, right? So people are both more rent burdened, and I'd add to what you shared, often getting a lower quality housing product despite being more rent burdened because of all those historic and current factors. So what do we do about that? Some of this, I would say, does need to be solved with public resources, greater investments of public resources, such as just any form of public subsidy stream. See what others want to share.
Just to make it like really explicit, when you talk about people being more rent burdened to get lower quality housing, I mean, they're like black neighborhoods on the south and west sides, you could easily be paying almost $1,000, $800 to $1,000 for a one-bedroom apartment, and there's plenty of landlords who do not provide appliances to renters. If you're on the north side, if you're gonna pay $1,000 for a one-bedroom apartment, I don't think people even think about the fact that they could maybe have to supply their own refrigerator and stove. That's like a reality in a lot of black neighborhoods in the city. So like, there is no city requirement that says landlords must provide basic appliances. Now, I'm not talking about like in-unit washer and dryer. I'm talking about a refrigerator and a stove so people can cook and buy food. And already in neighborhoods that are food deserts, it's very difficult to eat affordably. But then if you don't have a refrigerator in your home, how are you supposed to sustain your life? Because then you're constantly in a position to have to be paying someone else to to get takeout, to eat food out, or you have to rely. I've been on eviction runs with the sheriff's office where you go into someone's apartment and people literally have all they have is a crock pot hooked up to an electrical outlet, and that's how they cook their food, and all they can eat is things you can cook in a crock pot. So I mean, I don't know if I've never heard of any kind of like organizing efforts around forcing, creating a standard where landlords have to at least provide basic appliances to people, but that's an issue in terms of like the quality of housing that people are paying, exorbitant amounts of money for.
The only other thing I'd add, and then I'd turn it over to Daniel, is like often when we're working on affordable housing issues, we're
How do you explain the fact that cannabis is going to be legal, but you can't smoke it and stuff?
That's a little bit of a separate issue. I'm actually working on an article about this for our last issue of the year in December, for the last issue of the Reader that'll come out December 26th. Long story short is that is unlikely to be actually enforced. It's unlikely to be as big a problem as it seems, but that gets us away from the question of that the gentleman asked about what do you do about the substandard quality of housing and the exorbitant rent prices in black neighborhoods.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Jawanta alluded to about in Woodlawn and South Shore, the fight for community benefits agreement around the Obama Center is an example of what to do, right? To just try to make sure that there is genuinely more affordable housing created and protected and preserved. And they're doing a lot of work as well around city-owned lots and how to make sure city-owned lots are also used for the creation of affordable housing. There is always going to be an issue with housing affordability until we get to truly a living minimum wage, right? Like affordable housing is an issue because we do not pay our workers appropriately, and SSI benefits are not sufficient, and structural unemployment is super fucking real, right? And so there's an element that we can tackle through housing policy, or try to, and there's an element of like needing to be part of larger economic justice movements that is also really critical. But I think we have an example with kind of what COCO and STOP and the Community Benefits Coalition on the South Side is doing as one example.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly would agree with that last part, right? Housing exists as part of a larger ecosystem of economics and social, and that is definitely part of it. But I do want to answer your question in sort of two things. So number one is, and I'll try not to get into too much detail, but most of our housing, capital A affordable housing programs, many of them are funded through the federal government. They come with these sort of income targets, right? What does affordable mean? Well, we have to have an income in mind for that to mean, for that to be affordable. What is the income? We talk about it in terms of, this comes from the federal government. Area median income just means if you take all the people in the entire metro area, so Chicago and Aurora and Wilmette and everybody, what is the like middle level for a given household size? And usually the sort of target for most programs is like 60% of area median income. Which for a family of four is around, I want to say $42,000, which maybe it's a couple thousand higher than that. In any case, it is at a level that many people really do need help affording housing at that level. And also, we know from the data and from talking to people that the greatest need is at people who are making much less than that, right? The greatest need is at 30% of AMI and below. And so one thing that we have started trying to do is thinking about how can we retool our programs to serve more people at that level who are the people who need the most help, right? So, and I can just really quickly say two things. Number one, through our, again, I apologize, everything is these long acronyms, LIHTC, Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program. We've started just this fall to when we ask for affordable developers to give us proposals that they can now do something called income averaging, which basically says you don't have to set everybody at 60%. You can set a range of incomes, right? Some at 30 or 40%, some at 70 or 80, and that way you are creating some housing for people who are at those lower levels below 60%. The other thing is the main program that we have that does serve people at 30 and below is called the Rental Subsidy Program through the Chicago Low Income Housing Trust Fund. This year it served about, and for many years, it served about 2,700 families. We did get, in the budget, an additional infusion of money to up that by 500 families. So there will be an additional sort of 500 households assisted at that extremely low level. Now, obviously, I said earlier, we have a gap of 120,000. 500 does not close that gap, but it is at least moving us in the right direction. There's hopefully a down payment on something more. The one other thing I'll say really quickly, because I know we're wrapping up, but you know, we are looking at a range of, you know, basically we are asking ourselves the question, how can we make being a renter in Chicago more stable and just a safer thing to do? And you know, there's a lot of things that other people have already brought up, right? There's you mentioned the Just Cause for Eviction ordinance, the state ordinances, or rather state law bill that's been proposed around eviction sealing. So basically sealing the records of people who have been evicted for no fault, right? Who that eviction follows them around every time they apply for another apartment. There's the county ordinance which is passed, which we're looking at that basically tries to tamp down on discrimination against people who have certain criminal backgrounds or who have been involved in the criminal justice system, because we know the intersection of mass incarceration and systemic racism and housing is a major reason that a lot of housing instability exists. So we are also looking at some of those ways that we can make being a renter more stable and less disruptive in people's lives and less vulnerable to the kind of evictions and instability that you're talking about.
Well,
I think we're about out of time.
yeah, we're about out of time. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Let's thank our lovely guests. To link up with Leah Levinger, she and her colleague are around. You know, you guys will hang around to talk to folks if they're trying to get involved. Your city worker, advocate is here as well. Next First Tuesdays is going to be Tuesday, January 7th in the new year. We're going to be talking about Eddygate, police reform issues, and if with any luck, we'd like to get somebody, a proponent of GAPA and a proponent of CPAC up here for some fireworks on the best pathways to police reform. So yeah, please stay tuned. And please like and follow the First Tuesdays Facebook page, which is now out there on Facebook. And yeah, tell all your friends about First Tuesdays.
Absolutely. Take care, everybody.